Grandpa had always been a man of principle. Even in his late 80s, he carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind of presence that made everyone in the room pause and take notice. He wasn't wealthy by modern standards. He never sought flashy cars or exotic vacations, but he had something far more valuable: a lifetime of hard work, honesty, and a family that he loved with every fiber of his being. The farm he had built from scratch wasn't just land, it was a testament to decades of sweat, dedication, and unwavering commitment. Every fence post, every barn beam, every patch of soil had a story, a memory, a history. I had grown up watching him tend to the fields with a patience that seemed almost supernatural. He taught me more than how to plant crops or mend a fence. He taught me about respect, loyalty, and the weight of a promise. And over the years, it became clear that he held the family to the same standards he held himself to. Honesty above all, even when it hurt, even when it complicated things. Then came the day he sold the farm. It wasn't an easy decision. I remember standing beside him as he signed the papers, the sun setting behind the fields he had loved so much. The check was generous, $1 million. But more than the money, it was the intention behind it. He gave it to my stepdad with one simple request: care for me, he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. Treat me with respect. I've done my part for this family, now it's your turn to do yours. My stepdad accepted the money with a smile, a hug, and what looked like genuine gratitude. I watched the exchange, sensing a flicker of unease that I couldn't quite place. There was something in my stepdad's eyes, a shadow beneath the smile, that hinted at ambition, at calculation. I brushed it aside at first, thinking perhaps I was being overly cautious, perhaps even paranoid. After all, stepdad had always been part of the family. He had earned a place at the table. But within days, the first cracks appeared. The promises made with that $1 million check seemed to evaporate under the heat of opportunity. Grandpa was no longer welcomed in the same warm way he had always been. His visits, once celebrated, became inconvenient. The same stepdad who had pledged care began finding excuses. Too busy, too tired, too occupied with other matters. And then one stormy night, everything changed. The rain fell in sheets, hammering against the windows with relentless force. Thunder rumbled across the sky as if warning of the betrayal that was about to unfold. Grandpa arrived at the house soaked, leaning heavily on his cane, and expecting at least a warm meal, a bed, and a bit of comfort. But stepdad was waiting with cold indifference. "You'll have to go," he said almost casually, as if tossing out decades of loyalty and love were as simple as discarding an old coat. "There's no room here tonight." I remember the shock in Grandpa's eyes. He didn't shout, he didn't plead. He simply looked around the room, taking in the family he had supported, the promises he had trusted, and realizing in that moment that he had been abandoned. The hurt was tangible, raw, and almost suffocating. And in the same moment, I realized I had to act. I opened the door, gesturing for him to come inside. "Grandpa, you're staying with me tonight," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "You don't deserve this." Not from him, not from anyone. He hesitated for a moment, pride warring with the obvious need for shelter. And then slowly, with the kind of quiet dignity that always defined him, he stepped through the door. We sat by the fire that night, listening to the rain lash against the windows, and I watched him as he relaxed slightly, finally letting the tension of betrayal lift just enough for him to breathe. He didn't speak much, just a few quiet observations about the storm, the comfort of a warm room, and the relief of being with someone who truly cared. But I could see it in his eyes, the sadness of being turned away, the pain of promises broken, and the realization that trust could be so easily shattered. That night, I vowed silently that stepdad would not escape accountability. Grandpa's generosity, his hard work, and his trust would not be wasted. I would make sure that the betrayal he endured would not define the end of his story. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, and I knew this was only the beginning of a journey that would reveal truths, expose deceit, and ultimately bring justice to the man who deserved it most. The fire crackled softly, shadows dancing across the walls, and for the first time in days, Grandpa allowed himself a faint smile. "Thank you," he whispered, almost to himself. I knew someone still had my back. That simple acknowledgement, quiet as it was, filled the room with an emotional weight that no words could fully capture. It was a promise, a bond, and the start of a story that no one would forget. From that night onward, everything changed. Stepdad's betrayal became the fuel for a plan that would require patience, observation, and strategy. Every conversation, every visit, every interaction became a piece of the puzzle. I realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about respect, loyalty, and ensuring that Grandpa's final wishes, both explicit and unspoken, would be honored. As I watched him settle into a chair by the fire, wrapped in a warm blanket, I understood the stakes. This was not just family drama. This was a story of betrayal and justice, a story that would hold lessons for anyone who has ever trusted someone and been disappointed. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my chest, that the day would come when the truth would be revealed, and everyone would see what really mattered: loyalty, integrity, and the value of standing by those you love. The night stretched on, rain hammering, wind howling, but inside that small room there was warmth, safety, and a quiet determination. Grandpa had been wronged, yes, but he was not powerless. And neither was I. This was the moment when the seeds of justice were planted, the beginning of a journey that would lead to revelations, shock, and a climax that would leave everyone speechless. Grandpa had always been a man of remarkable resilience. Born into a modest family during a time when life was harsher than most could imagine, he learned the value of hard work early. By the time he was a teenager, he was already familiar with long hours, aching muscles, and the unspoken truth that nothing worthwhile ever comes easy. But hardship never hardened him in the wrong ways. It shaped a man of deep compassion, of integrity, and of unwavering principles. The farm he built wasn't merely a source of income. It was his life's work, a symbol of perseverance and pride. I grew up watching him rise before the sun, checking the fences, feeding the animals, and tending to crops with a meticulous hand and a patient heart. He never sought praise, never boasted, but his dedication spoke louder than words ever could. The farm was more than land. It was a legacy, a repository of memories, and a reflection of the man he had become. Over the years, Grandpa developed strong relationships within the family. He treated everyone with respect, whether it was his children, stepchildren, or grandchildren. He believed that family was a bond of trust, loyalty, and mutual care. But with that generosity came vulnerability. His trust was a gift, freely given, and he often assumed that others would honor it as he honored theirs. Stepdad entered the picture when I was still a teenager. On the surface, he seemed like a good man, a family-oriented individual who expressed love and respect. But beneath the smile and polite words lay ambition, a desire for wealth, and a subtle cunning that Grandpa, for all his wisdom, couldn't quite see. Stepdad had married into the family and slowly positioned himself as a trusted caretaker. Over time, he built the appearance of loyalty, always present at dinners, celebrations, and family events, but gradually the seeds of entitlement began to show. Grandpa, in his characteristic generosity, chose to see the best in people. He believed that with guidance, people could rise to their better selves. He had always emphasized that wealth was a tool to support loved ones, not a weapon to manipulate them. So when he made the decision to sell the farm, he did it with the assumption that the family would honor his intentions. The $1 million from the sale was a considerable sum, but more than that, it represented trust. Grandpa gave it to Stepdad with a simple, heartfelt plea: care for me in my old age, protect me, and treat my final years with the dignity I had always tried to uphold. I remember sitting with Grandpa on the porch the day he signed the paperwork. He spoke with quiet solemnity, explaining his intentions to me, his eyes reflective of years gone by. "I've done my part," he said, the wind rustling through the trees, carrying the scent of freshly turned soil. "Now it's their turn. I just hope they understand what responsibility truly means." There was no bitterness in his tone, only a deep-seated hope that family would honor trust and loyalty above greed. In the days after the sale, Stepdad initially appeared grateful, offering hugs, kind words, and assurances that Grandpa would be well cared for. But even in those early interactions, there were subtle hints of imbalance, an impatience with trivial matters, a dismissive glance when Grandpa expressed preferences, a faint smirk when discussing the future. I noticed it, though I didn't fully grasp the depth of what it meant at the time. The rest of the family seemed oblivious. They saw a harmonious household, a stepdad dutifully caring for the patriarch, and they took the appearances at face value. But as with many betrayals, the danger often hides in the mundane, in the small compromises, the subtle dismissals, and the unspoken power plays that unfold quietly over time. Grandpa continued his daily routines as if nothing had changed. He tended to small chores around the house, walked in the garden, and shared stories of his past with me, always emphasizing wisdom, patience, and perspective. But beneath the surface, he was aware. He felt the shift, a subtle coldness that hadn't been there before. Stepdad was changing, and the care that had been promised was no longer consistent with Grandpa's expectations or needs. The context of the betrayal becomes clearer when you understand how much Grandpa valued respect. Money for him was secondary to dignity. To be turned away, especially during a vulnerable moment, was not just a breach of promise. It was an affront to his life's principles. The farm had been sold with the belief that trust and care would follow, that his final years would be marked by security and comfort, not neglect. As I reflect on those weeks before the stormy night, it becomes apparent how carefully the situation unfolded. Stepdad's ambitions grew gradually, masked by a facade of concern and duty. He manipulated small family disputes, twisted minor grievances, and created an environment where Grandpa's needs could be dismissed as unreasonable. Every interaction was a test, and every lapse in vigilance by the family allowed the deception to strengthen. Grandpa, despite his wisdom, could not have foreseen the sheer audacity of the betrayal that awaited him. He assumed good faith, a fundamental human expectation that we all carry. That assumption made him vulnerable, and yet it also made his character luminous. In a world where many would exploit trust, he chose to honor it. That was the essence of his integrity, and ultimately, what made the betrayal so devastating. I began to notice patterns myself. The subtle changes in Stepdad's tone, the dismissive gestures, the hurried explanations for minor things. It was enough to raise suspicion, though not yet enough to act decisively. I observed quietly, documenting, internalizing, preparing for the inevitable moment when Grandpa would need someone to stand firmly beside him. The background, the context, and the history of relationships are critical here. Without understanding Grandpa's values, his life's work, and the significance of the trust he placed in Stepdad, the betrayal would appear simply as greed. But in reality, it was a violation of everything Grandpa had worked for and believed in. The $1 million was more than money. It was a test of character, and Stepdad failed spectacularly. As the days led up to that fateful night, the tension was almost palpable. Grandpa sensed it, though he did not fully articulate it. Stepdad's actions became more brazen, more casual in their cruelty. He dismissed Grandpa's requests, belittled minor concerns, and prepared, unknowingly, to enact the betrayal that would be forever etched in the family's memory. By the time the storm approached, the background was set. Grandpa had given his trust, Stepdad had accepted the money, and the stage was ready for the confrontation that would ignite the emotional core of the story. It was a lesson in human nature, in loyalty, and in the consequences of greed disguised as care. Every moment leading to that night was a thread weaving the intricate tapestry of betrayal, preparation, and eventual justice. And through it all, I remained vigilant, observing, listening, and preparing to act when the time came. Because in this story, awareness was the difference between another tragedy and the protection of a man who deserved respect and love until his last days. The tension in the house grew gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Stepdad's polite smiles became sharper, his gestures slightly colder. It was subtle enough that anyone who wasn't paying attention might have overlooked it. But I noticed every detail. The sighs when Grandpa asked for small favors, the quick dismissals of his stories, and the ever-present sense that Stepdad's patience had limits far shorter than his promises. Grandpa, for his part, remained composed. He didn't confront Stepdad directly, not yet. That wasn't his way. He hoped, as he always did, that people would do the right thing. But the unease in his eyes betrayed his confidence. Even the simplest interactions carried a weight now, an invisible tension that no one else in the family seemed to see. It started with small things. Stepdad would leave Grandpa's coffee cold on the counter, claiming he forgot. He would hurry past his father, in-law's careful explanations about farm finances, shrugging off concerns that had once been treated with respect. Even his words began to carry a sharper edge. "You don't need to worry about this," he'd say, tone clipped. "Let me handle it." Words meant to reassure, but their underlying arrogance stung. I tried to imagine what Grandpa felt in those moments, having devoted his life to building trust, only to have it eroded so subtly, day by day. He was a man used to working hard, used to solving problems, and yet powerless in his own home, and I could see that sense of helplessness settling deeper with every slight. Then came the more overt signs. Stepdad began restricting Grandpa's access to certain accounts, quietly suggesting that would be safer this way. Family members, distracted by their own routines, didn't notice. But I did. I could see that the man who had once promised care was beginning to manipulate control. The $1 million, entrusted with a request for protection and respect, now seemed to be a tool for Stepdad's ambition. Grandpa tried to remain diplomatic, but I could see the frustration building. One evening, as he sat in his chair by the window, he whispered quietly to me, "I never imagined it would come to this, that someone I trusted so completely could turn so quickly." His voice was low, almost resigned, but there was a quiet determination behind it. That's when I realized this wasn't just a passing disappointment. This was a slow, deliberate betrayal, and it was happening right before our eyes. Stepdad's behavior escalated in ways that were impossible to ignore. He began questioning Grandpa's decisions openly during family gatherings, subtly undermining his authority, and mocking minor mistakes with a smirk that made everyone else laugh nervously. The humiliation was deliberate, calculated to chip away at Grandpa's confidence and make him feel small in the eyes of the family. I tried to intervene subtly. I would redirect conversations, offer gentle reminders, and stand by Grandpa's side whenever the subtle attacks became too much. But Stepdad was clever. He masked his cruelty with charm, laughter, and the occasional kind word, making it difficult for others to see the full picture. Only Grandpa and I truly understood the depth of the threat, and I began to realize that mere observation would not be enough. Action would eventually be required. The family dynamic became increasingly strained. Cousins and siblings who had once enjoyed casual visits now hesitated. Tension hung in the air like a heavy fog, and even small remarks could ignite arguments. Grandpa remained calm outwardly, but the weight of disrespect and betrayal was evident in his expressions, the way he sometimes stared silently at the walls, lost in thought. Stepdad's greed became more overt when he began talking about future investments, hinting at decisions that would benefit him alone. Grandpa objected quietly, trying to reason with him, but his words were met with impatience. "It's my money now," Stepdad said one afternoon, voice sharp, "and I can decide what's best." The words cut deep, not just because of their cruelty, but because they betrayed the sacred trust that Grandpa had placed in him. I began documenting everything. Every dismissive remark, every small slight, every calculated act of manipulation. It wasn't just to expose him later, it was to ensure that Grandpa's legacy and dignity would be protected. Observing, recording, and preparing, I knew it was only a matter of time before Stepdad's ambition would escalate into outright betrayal. The turning point of rising conflict came one evening during dinner. Stepdad, in front of the whole family, criticized Grandpa for a minor miscalculation about estate planning. "You're overthinking it," he said with a patronizing smile. "Leave the decisions to me." Grandpa remained silent, choosing not to escalate the confrontation. But I could see the hurt and indignity in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he pushed his plate away. After dinner, I spoke with Grandpa privately. "He's testing you," I said, my voice steady. "And he's trying to see how far he can push you. But you're not alone. I'll make sure he doesn't succeed." Grandpa nodded, a quiet gratitude in his gaze, but also a flicker of sadness. He had given his trust freely, and now he was learning that not everyone is worthy of it. The days that followed were a delicate balance of observation and preparation. Stepdad's subtle manipulations continued, but so did my vigilance. I watched his interactions with the family, noting patterns, documenting inconsistencies, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The storm was building quietly, almost imperceptibly, but the signs were all there. Grandpa began confiding in me more, sharing memories of how he had built the farm, of the sacrifices he had made, and of the people he had trusted over a lifetime. His voice carried a mix of pride, sadness, and resilience. He never blamed anyone openly, never lashed out, but I could feel the weight of betrayal settling over him like a shadow. And then, one stormy night, the subtle tension erupted into a full-blown crisis. Stepdad, emboldened by his unchecked ambition, crossed a line that could not be ignored. Grandpa arrived at the house seeking shelter, care, and the warmth he had been promised, only to be met with rejection. "There's no room here tonight," Stepdad said, voice devoid of warmth, his tone final. The words landed like thunder, and the betrayal that had been simmering for weeks became painfully, heartbreakingly real. In that moment, I realized that rising conflict had reached its peak. The subtle undermining, the dismissive remarks, the manipulations, all of it had led to this night. Grandpa, the man who had spent a lifetime teaching integrity and respect, was now forced into a vulnerable position by someone he had trusted. But I also knew that this wasn't the end. The seeds of justice had already been planted. Observation, documentation, and strategic patience had prepared us for the moment when Stepdad's betrayal would be fully exposed. This was the night that marked the transition from rising conflict to a turning point, from injustice to the possibility of accountability. As the storm raged outside, I helped Grandpa inside, offering comfort, warmth, and reassurance. The house was filled with tension, yes, but also with the quiet determination that justice would come. Stepdad's actions had escalated the conflict, but in doing so, he had also set the stage for the eventual climax. The moment when Grandpa's dignity would be restored, his wishes honored, and the betrayal fully revealed. The night was long, the rain relentless, but for Grandpa and me, it was the beginning of the next chapter, a chapter defined not by fear or betrayal, but by loyalty, strategy, and the unwavering commitment to protect what was rightfully his. The storm had settled into a steady rhythm by the time Grandpa arrived at the house that night. Rain pelted the roof with relentless intensity, and wind howled through the trees like a chorus of warnings. I could see it in his eyes. The exhaustion, the indignity, the quiet despair of a man who had given so much and was now being turned away. Stepdad stood by the doorway, posture rigid, face hardened, and in that moment, all pretense of care and gratitude evaporated. "There's no room here tonight," Stepdad said again, as if repetition might make the words easier to accept. But they weren't. They were knives, sharp and deliberate, aimed at the heart of a man who had spent a lifetime building a family and a home. Grandpa's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes reflecting both shock and sorrow, but he did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The betrayal was visible enough to anyone paying attention. I stepped forward, my own heart racing. "Grandpa, come inside," I said, opening the door and gesturing for him to enter. He hesitated for a moment, pride warring with necessity, but the storm outside was merciless. Slowly, deliberately, he accepted, allowing me to guide him to warmth, safety, and the reassurance that someone still cared. Once inside, the tension was almost tangible. The room seemed smaller somehow, heavy with unspoken words and broken promises. Grandpa sat by the fire, hands clasped tightly together, while I fetched a blanket and a warm drink. Every movement he made was careful, measured, as though he were testing whether the betrayal had truly occurred or if this was some cruel illusion. But it wasn't. Stepdad's rejection had been real, deliberate, and devastating. As I watched him settle, I realized that the emotional weight of this moment was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. Grandpa had been wronged in a way that struck at his dignity, his trust, and the very principles he had lived by. And yet, there was no bitterness in his eyes, only a quiet sadness, tempered by a lifetime of resilience. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm batter the windows, letting the sound fill the room and give space for reflection. Grandpa finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I never imagined someone I trusted would do this to me," he said, almost as if confessing a secret. "I thought my family understood the value of respect, of loyalty, but I was wrong." There was no anger, only a sorrow that seemed to weigh the room down. I placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault," I said. "You did everything right. You trusted, you gave, and you loved. That's on him, not you." Grandpa nodded, eyes glistening, and I knew he understood. But this wasn't just about comfort and words. It was about action. The betrayal was too severe to ignore, too public to remain unaddressed, and I could feel the moment as the turning point of everything we had been preparing for. Stepdad's deception had not gone unnoticed. Over the past weeks, I had documented every slight, every dismissive remark, every subtle manipulation. Now, with the betrayal fully exposed, those observations transformed into a plan. A strategy to ensure that Grandpa's dignity and his final wishes would be honored. The emotional intensity of the night only fueled my determination. Grandpa, wrapped in the blanket I had draped over him, began to recount stories of his past, moments of hardship, triumph, and lessons learned. Each story carried weight, each memory was a reminder of his resilience, and each word reinforced the injustice of what Stepdad had done. I listened closely, knowing that these reflections would later guide how we approached the eventual confrontation, the ultimate unveiling of truth at the will reading. The emotional peak of this night wasn't just in witnessing betrayal. It was in understanding its full scope. Stepdad had not merely denied Grandpa a room or comfort. He had denied him respect, care, and acknowledgement of a lifetime of dedication. And as I looked at Grandpa, I realized that the storm outside was mirrored in the storm within him. The turmoil of being betrayed by someone you trusted more than any other. But there was also clarity. In the midst of the pain, Grandpa's strength shone through. He did not lash out, he did not seek vengeance in anger. He simply accepted the truth and allowed us to plan for justice. That calm resolve, forged over decades of hard work and principled living, transformed the emotional weight of betrayal into a force for eventual redemption. We spent the night discussing the days to come, the steps that needed to be taken to ensure that Grandpa's intentions were honored. Every detail mattered: how to approach the family, how to protect him from further harm, how to prepare for the will reading that would ultimately expose the truth. The storm outside began to subside, leaving only the quiet drip of rain from the eaves, but the emotional storm inside was far from over. Grandpa looked at me, a mixture of gratitude and quiet determination in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "You've given me more than shelter tonight. You've reminded me that loyalty still exists, even when betrayal is close." I nodded, understanding that the bond we shared in that moment was stronger than any deceit, any greed, and any challenge that lay ahead. The turning point had arrived. Stepdad's betrayal had forced action, and in doing so, it revealed the core of our story: a family fractured by greed, a grandfather's dignity threatened, and a plan for justice waiting to unfold. The night would be remembered not just for the storm that raged outside, but for the storm of emotions, revelations, and resolutions that had begun within the walls of that small room. As dawn approached, the first light filtered through the wet trees outside. Grandpa, finally able to rest, seemed lighter, unburdened by the immediate threat, yet the knowledge that this betrayal would have consequences hung in the air. The emotional peak had been reached. The betrayal exposed, the pain felt, and the determination to see justice served fully ignited. This night marked the boundary between suffering and action, between quiet endurance and strategic retaliation. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within our family was only beginning. And in that quiet morning, as Grandpa rested and I reviewed the steps ahead, I knew that the next chapter, the will reading, the confrontation, and the eventual revelation, would leave everyone speechless. It was in this emotional crucible, forged through betrayal, care, and unwavering loyalty, that the real story took shape. Grandpa's dignity remained intact, my resolve solidified, and Stepdad's reckoning drew closer with every passing moment. The turning point had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same again. The day of the will reading arrived with a strange tension in the air, the kind of heavy anticipation that made every step toward the lawyer's office feel like walking through a storm. Grandpa, calm yet resolute, sat beside me as we entered the room. Stepdad, unaware of how thoroughly his actions had been observed and recorded, carried his usual smug air, assuming the ceremony would conclude exactly as he intended. He didn't suspect that the very plan he had crafted so carefully would unravel in the most spectacular way possible. Family members trickled in, exchanging polite greetings, nervous smiles, and subtle glances. Cousins whispered, aunts adjusted their seating, and the lawyer, a seasoned professional with decades of experience, shuffled papers and prepared to read Grandpa's final wishes aloud. The atmosphere was formal, tense, and electric, each heartbeat echoing like a drum signaling the climax of years of trust, betrayal, and careful observation. Stepdad sat near the center, confident, assured. He had imagined this day as the crowning moment of his manipulation. After all, he had secured the 1 in a million, controlled access, and dismissed Grandpa's presence as inconvenient. Yet he didn't realize that Grandpa, ever the strategist, had foreseen the potential for betrayal. In that quiet room, every detail mattered, and every word would carry weight. The lawyer cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "We are gathered here today to honor the wishes of Mr. Robert Harris, who entrusted his estate to be distributed according to his final directives. As you know, these matters are private, and it is my duty to read them faithfully." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to be felt in every corner. The reading began with smaller, familiar bequests, family heirlooms, personal mementos, and sentimental items. Laughter and light murmurs accompanied these gifts, as relatives exchanged knowing smiles and whispered congratulations. Grandpa's hand rested lightly on mine, a subtle reminder of trust, patience, and the deep bond we shared. Stepdad, meanwhile, maintained his confident posture, his expression betraying none of the suspicion that would soon overwhelm him. Then the lawyer reached the pivotal section. Now, regarding the distribution of the primary estate, including the financial assets and real property that Mr. Harris had entrusted during his lifetime. His voice slowed, measured, deliberate. Stepdad's smug confidence faltered slightly as he leaned forward, sensing that the moment he had taken for granted was approaching. "Mr. Harris has specified that any individual who fails to honor his final wishes for care and respect during his lifetime shall forfeit claims to the estate." The words hung in the air like lightning, and I saw the first flicker of unease cross Stepdad's face. The lawyer continued, outlining the details. Those who had shown neglect, indifference, or outright betrayal would not inherit, while those who had remained loyal, attentive, and caring would be rewarded. Grandpa's gaze met mine briefly, and in that look, I saw a mixture of relief, vindication, and quiet pride. He had orchestrated this moment with foresight, ensuring that integrity would triumph over greed. Stepdad's hands, previously relaxed on his lap, began to clench, knuckles white with tension. He understood, finally, that his years of manipulation, deceit, and betrayal had not gone unnoticed. The lawyer continued, naming specific individuals, recounting instances of care, dedication, and respect. Each name called brought smiles and acknowledgement from those who had truly honored Grandpa's principles. Then came the pivotal revelation: Stepdad's omission, neglect, and outright rejection of Grandpa during the stormy night were documented and recognized. By Grandpa's explicit instructions, this betrayal had consequences. Stepdad's face went pale, and a hush fell over the room. Every eye turned toward him, some in shock, others in silent satisfaction. The air was heavy with anticipation, every person aware that the climax of years-long betrayal and careful planning had arrived. Grandpa, serene as ever, simply watched, a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. Justice, delayed but inevitable, was unfolding before us all. The final instructions were clear. The $100 million that Stepdad had assumed as his entitlement was redirected. Portions were allocated to those who had shown loyalty, to charities Grandpa had long supported, and to my direct care, ensuring his well-being and comfort in his final days. Stepdad, stripped of entitlement and dignity, could only sit in stunned silence, realizing that his arrogance and betrayal had led to complete public exposure. I felt a mix of emotions: relief for Grandpa, satisfaction for justice, and a strange empathy for the man who had failed so completely. Stepdad had made choices that revealed his character fully, choices that could not be undone, and the consequences were laid bare for all to witness. The room, once tense with expectation, now vibrated with the quiet affirmation that right had triumphed over wrongdoing. Grandpa turned slightly toward me, a soft smile on his lips. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You understood what I needed, and you were here." I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment and the full impact of the journey we had endured together. The emotional resonance of this climax wasn't just about financial justice. It was about dignity restored, trust vindicated, and the affirmation that loyalty and care are never wasted. Stepdad eventually rose, muttered a few incoherent words, and left the room. The humiliation was complete, yet it was not driven by anger or cruelty. It was the natural result of choices made and principles ignored. Grandpa, calm and dignified, remained seated, surrounded by those who had honored him, protected him, and truly valued his life and legacy. As the lawyer concluded the reading, the room felt lighter. There was laughter, quiet tears, and an unspoken recognition that this moment would be remembered for a lifetime. Grandpa's wishes had been fulfilled with precision, and the betrayal that had once threatened to undermine his dignity had instead highlighted the true character of those around him. In that climax, the audience witnesses the full arc of the story: the trust, the betrayal, the careful observation, the patience, and finally, the restoration of justice. Stepdad's greed had been exposed, Grandpa's integrity celebrated, and the emotional resonance of right prevailing over wrong cemented in every heart present. This was the turning point where all the threads of tension, conflict, and emotion converged, leaving no doubt that loyalty and integrity are forces more powerful than wealth, deception, or ambition. Grandpa's life, his principles, and his trust had been vindicated, setting the stage for the emotional reflection and closure that would follow in the final acts. The room had finally begun to settle. The tension that had gripped every corner slowly gave way to quiet reflections, subdued conversations, and the soft sounds of deep breathing. Grandpa sat in his chair, a calm presence amidst the emotional aftermath of the will reading. The justice that had been denied to him in subtle ways for so long was now fully realized, and though the storm of betrayal had been fierce, the restoration of dignity brought a profound sense of relief. I took a moment to look around at everyone present. Faces that had been tense now softened. Some carried tears, others smiled quietly, and a few wore expressions of shame. Stepdad's absence left a palpable void in the room, a reminder of the consequences of choices driven by greed, arrogance, and deceit. It was a lesson in human nature that could not be ignored. Those who betray trust may gain temporarily, but the weight of their actions eventually catches up with them. Grandpa turned to me, eyes glistening with gratitude. "I wasn't about the money," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I was about respect, about love, about being seen as a human being until the end. That's the true inheritance we pass on, not wealth, but dignity and principles. His words carried a resonance that went beyond the room, beyond the family, and spoke directly to the heart. I helped him rise from the chair, supporting him gently. We moved toward the window, watching the sun break through clouds, the remnants of the storm casting a golden glow across the landscape. There was a beauty in the aftermath, a sense of renewal, as though the trials of betrayal had washed away the darkness and left a quiet clarity behind. In the days that followed, life began to return to a semblance of normalcy, but nothing felt ordinary. Grandpa's home was peaceful again, cared for by those who truly valued him. I spent hours listening to his stories, learning lessons that went beyond wealth or property. Lessons about patience, foresight, and the importance of observing human nature carefully. Each story reinforced a moral truth: that trust is sacred, and when betrayed it leaves scars, but when honored, it strengthens bonds that last a lifetime. I also reflected on my own role in the events. Vigilance, observation, and strategic action had been necessary. It was not enough to witness betrayal. One must act wisely, with patience, and with a clear understanding of the consequences. Stepdad's misdeeds were exposed not through aggression or revenge, but through careful planning and adherence to Grandpa's principles. The lesson was clear: justice can be served without losing integrity. For the rest of the family, this experience became a mirror. They saw the consequences of inaction, the dangers of turning a blind eye, and the profound impact of loyalty. Many expressed gratitude, quietly acknowledging the importance of standing by loved ones, of protecting their dignity, and of valuing principles over convenience or ambition. Grandpa's reflections became a guiding light. He spoke often about the importance of empathy, of observing the subtle signs of human behavior, and of understanding that integrity is tested not in moments of comfort, but in times of challenge. People reveal who they are when it matters most, he said. The truth will always surface, and it's our duty to act wisely when it does. I also realized that emotional resilience plays a critical role in navigating family dynamics. Grandpa's ability to remain composed, even when betrayed, allowed us to act decisively. Anger or impulsiveness could have escalated the situation, but calm determination created space for justice to unfold naturally. There was a profound lesson here in life: the storms we endure are inevitable, but how we respond defines the outcome. In sharing this story with you, the audience, there is an important takeaway: betrayal, no matter how painful, can be met with strategic wisdom and moral clarity. We cannot control the choices of others, but we can control our actions, our integrity, and our response to injustice. Grandpa's legacy teaches us that dignity, patience, and careful observation are more powerful than wealth, deception, or temporary gain. For those navigating similar situations, the advice is clear: pay attention to subtle signs, document actions, and trust your instincts. Seek guidance from those you trust, and never allow fear or intimidation to silence your voice. Standing by loved ones, protecting their dignity, and acting with integrity ensures that justice, when it comes, is both fair and effective. As I helped Grandpa settle back into his routine, I saw the profound emotional impact this journey had on him and on all of us. There was healing in the resolution, closure in the accountability, and peace in knowing that the principles he lived by had triumphed. Money could not replace trust, and wealth could not substitute for integrity. But fairness, loyalty, and love created a foundation stronger than any inheritance. The final lesson was also deeply personal: life is fleeting, and the bonds we nurture define our legacy. Grandpa's story reminds us that the true measure of family is not in shared assets, but in shared respect, care, and the unwavering commitment to honor one another. Betrayal may hurt, but wisdom, patience, and action guided by principle ensure that the heart of the family remains intact. As the days passed, Grandpa would often smile quietly, recounting memories, teaching lessons, and imparting wisdom. I listened, learning not just about family, but about life itself. The importance of vigilance, the power of patience, and the strength that comes from integrity. The storm of betrayal had passed, and in its place, a calm clarity emerged. For anyone watching, remember this: loyalty and integrity are tested in times of challenge. Those who betray will eventually face the consequences of their actions, while those who act with honor, courage, and wisdom will find justice, peace, and the satisfaction of knowing they upheld what truly matters. Grandpa's story is a testament to that truth, a lesson in dignity, strategy, and the enduring power of doing what is right, even when it is difficult. And as we reflect, the emotional resonance lingers: love, respect, and integrity are the true inheritance we leave behind, far more enduring than money, property, or fleeting privilege. Grandpa's life, his principles, and the careful actions that followed betrayal teach us that even in the darkest moments, clarity, justice, and peace are possible when we act with wisdom and heart. As the days settled into routine, and the storm of betrayal became nothing more than a memory, I found myself reflecting on the lessons we had lived through. Grandpa, once a man whose trust had been tested in the most painful way, now sat serenely, surrounded by family who truly valued him. There was peace in the home again, and a quiet sense of triumph that could not be measured by money or material possessions. Looking back, I realized how delicate trust is, and how easily it can be fractured, but also how resilient it can be when nurtured with care and vigilance. The events of that stormy night, Stepdad's betrayal, and the ultimate reading of the will had revealed something profound. Actions have consequences, and integrity always finds a way to surface. Grandpa often shared his thoughts with me quietly, in moments that felt private but carried universal wisdom. Life, he said, is full of storms. You cannot control when they arrive, but you can control how you respond. Respect and loyalty are not just words. They are the armor that protects what is truly valuable. His voice carried a warmth that reminded me why justice without bitterness is the most powerful form of victory. Through this experience, I also saw the importance of patience and observation. Stepdad's betrayal did not go unnoticed. Every dismissive remark, every subtle slight, every act of greed had been quietly documented, studied, and prepared for. It was not vengeance that guided our actions, but careful strategy rooted in love, loyalty, and principle. There is a lesson here for anyone watching. Patience is not passive. It is a form of strength, a tool to navigate the complexities of human relationships. The will reading had been the climax, the moment when hidden truths were exposed and justice restored. But reflection goes beyond that single moment. It encompasses understanding human nature, recognizing patterns of deceit, and valuing those who demonstrate care and integrity. Grandpa's experience reminds us that wealth and privilege mean little without trust, respect, and love in the family. Now, as the sun sets on this chapter, I want to share the final, most important takeaways. Protect those you love, honor their wishes, and never allow greed or betrayal to overshadow what truly matters. Pay attention to subtle signs, listen to your instincts, and act with wisdom and courage when confronted with injustice. And most importantly, remember that integrity is timeless. It is the legacy that endures far beyond any inheritance or property. Grandpa's story, though rooted in betrayal, ultimately became one of redemption, strategy, and moral clarity. It is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, careful observation, steadfast loyalty, and principled action can restore dignity and bring justice. Life may test us, but the choices we make define our character, our legacy, and the impact we leave on those we love. As we conclude this story, I want to take a moment to thank you, the viewer, for taking this journey with us. Thank you for witnessing the trials, the betrayal, the careful planning, and the eventual justice that restored Grandpa's dignity. Stories like this are more than entertainment. They are lessons in life, love, and family. If this story moved you, inspired reflection, or taught you the value of loyalty and integrity, I invite you to show your support. Like, comment, and share your thoughts. Your engagement helps these lessons reach more hearts and homes. And if you want to hear more stories of family, betrayal, and justice, click to subscribe and join our community, where we uncover lessons hidden in real life experiences. Remember, life is filled with moments that test trust, patience, and courage. Grandpa's story reminds us that even when betrayed, justice can prevail, dignity can be restored, and love can guide the path forward. Carry these lessons with you, cherish your family, and always act with wisdom and integrity. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for sharing in this journey. Your time and attention honor not just the story, but the values it represents. Stay strong, stay loyal, and remember that every act of care and integrity leaves a legacy far greater than any material inheritance.